Welcome back, everyone. Our series continues with I'm not sure where are we continuing? The Battle of Axona. That's where we're starting. We just saw Caesar basically police the region and expel two different conflicts. Let's see what happens at the Battle of Axona.
But by wintering his legions in Gallic territory, Caesar was making a point. This was beginning to look less like intervention
And like an occupation is what he's going to say.
and more like occupation. With the Germanic threat dealt with, Caesar would be able to turn his attention to Gaul proper.
I love how he has like a sort of like a crown here on this animation. I wonder, did he even wear a crown? I mean, obviously, the crown doesn't even come up into play until late in his ruling, and that's like deferred as like a almost like a dictator for life. But wondering if this is something else or this is just not important in terms of like the specifics.
The Belgae were a loose collection of various tribes, and had fought constant wars with the Germanic tribes across the Rhine, which had fostered a strong and experienced warrior culture. They knew of how successful Caesar had been in Gaul already, and were justifiably suspicious of his intentions. To counter the rising Roman threat, the Belgae formed a confederation, led by King Galba of the Suessiones.
I love these animations. I wonder how accurate this is in terms of like the terrain, the building structures, the building types, the materials, the uniforms, all that. If you guys do know, let me know how accurate this is.
Labienus sent word of this coalition to Caesar in Cisalpine Gaul, who immediately took action. Caesar raised a further 2 legions and moved straight to the Belgae border. It is worth noting that Caesar now had 8 legions under his command, approximately 44,000 men including auxiliaries, double the amount he had initially been allocated by the Senate. Furthermore, while the Belgae raising an army could certainly be seen as a potential threat, Caesar made no efforts to get the casus bellus he had when fighting the Helvetii and Suebi. The Republic had less and less control over Caesar, and many in Rome were beginning to talk about these conquests not being in Rome's best interest, but in Caesar's.
Well, over time, this area, I'm not sure what happens after or once Augustus takes the throne as an emperor in terms of what happens to Gaul, but Gaul is like a huge strategical area that becomes under Roman's influence that lets them catapult to Britain, as well as the tribute that they get from Gaul. I'm sure helps a ton of citizens.
Nevertheless, Caesar marched his legions quickly into the territory of the nearest Belgic tribe, the Remi, who were completely taken aback by the speed at which the Romans had been able to mobilize and surrendered instantly, swearing to Caesar that they had never been a part of the confederation. The Remi even provided Caesar with all the information they had on the alliance, including which tribes were involved, how many men each tribe was contributing, and that they were currently marching towards the Remi's territory.
They some snitches.
With this information, Caesar convinced his Gallic allies, the Aedui, led now by Divitiacus, to invade the lands of the Belvaci, a powerful Belgae tribe, to open a second front, while he marched towards the Belgic alliance's main army. Caesar crossed a bridge over the Axona River and encamped in a strong position on a hill on the other side. The river provided protection from the rear, and marshy land at his front made a frontal assault difficult. Furthermore, Caesar had learned his lesson from fighting Ariovistus,
I just noticed all those troops at the top left. Oh my.
And left 6 cohorts in a well-fortified position on the other side of the bridge, securing his supply line. With no chance of being starved out from his position, Caesar waited for the Belgae to make their move.
Very patient.
Meanwhile, the Belgae had marched to the Remi town of Bibrax, just 8 miles from where Caesar was encamped, and besieged it. Caesar gives the total number of the confederation as 300,000. However, it is unclear how much this number is exaggerated and how many of these men were currently in the army.
Obviously, we know during this time and throughout history, up until like real accurate numbers are starting to show, this was a huge exaggeration. 300,000, we could probably say a fourth of that, maybe.
A more realistic estimation would be somewhere around 80,000 men. Still,
basically what I said.
Still a force to be reckoned with, almost double that of Caesar's. In the face of such a large force, the Remi sent messages to Caesar saying that they would be unable to hold the town without his help. Caesar, however, was reluctant to give up his defensive position, as he thought that the attack on Bibrax was a trap designed to force him to do that. Instead, he kept his legions in camp, but sent a substantial contingent of auxiliaries, composed mainly of Cretan archers and Balearic slingers, to sneak into Bibrax to help the Remi. With Bibrax thus reinforced, and Caesar not taking the bait, Galba instead marched his army to meet the Romans, encamping just 2 miles from the Roman camp.
Ah, good call.
Caesar was reluctant to engage Galba straight away, and instead focused on cavalry skirmishes to test the strength of the Belgae. While this was going on, he further reinforced his position, digging long trenches and constructing defensive towers on the flanks of his position.
One thing I do know, I know sometimes this takes a while, these standoffs, but the soldiers of Rome really know how to build quickly.
Realizing that attacking such a strong position would be suicidal, Galba instead sent roughly 15,000 to 20,000 men to ford the river and attack the 6 cohorts on the other side, hoping either to draw Caesar from the hill or to cut off his supply line and starve him out.
Smart. Are those chariots? I think those are chariots.
Seeing this, Caesar gathered all his light infantry and cavalry and marched quickly to oppose the crossing.
It might not be chariots, I can't tell.
Leaving his legions in their defensive position. The Roman cavalry arrived just in time and fell upon the few Belgae who had made it to the other bank, killing many and forcing them back into the river. At the same time, the Roman missile troops peppered the Belgae still in the water with stones, javelins, and arrows. They doggedly tried to continue their crossing despite taking heavy casualties, but Galba had no choice but to pull his men back.
So twice they've tried to do something sneaky. They still are sieging Bibrax, my bad. But the river ford that they tried to do did not work.
To make matters worse, word had now reached him that the Aedui were rampaging through the Belgae lands. With the Romans to his front so heavily dug in, and with another army now threatening his flank, Galba decided to withdraw. The tribes would all disperse to their respective homelands, but all agreed to reassemble if the Romans marched further into Belgae lands.
What does Caesar do?
As the Confederation's army dispersed, Caesar cautiously pursued with his cavalry and 3 legions under Labienus, harassing the Belgae. Due to their lack of coordination, the Belgae suffered heavy casualties in this retreat. The battle had cost the Confederation approximately 10,000 men and had forced the tribes to divide, making them easier for Caesar to conquer.
Wow.
Many tribes simply surrendered in the face of the Roman legions.
Look how much territory he's just easily just swallowing.
Including the Belgae and Galba's Suessiones. However, deeper in Belgae territory, the Nervii did have the time to organize and were not going to give up so easily. They were outraged by Caesar's foray into Belgae territory, and alongside their neighbors, the Virumandui, Atrebates, and Aduatuci, were able to gather an army of approximately 50,000 men, led by the Nervii king, Bodognatus. Caesar, hearing that this force was gathering against him, marched for the river Sabis on the edge of Nervii territory. Bodugnatus had learned the lesson from Galba, and knew that he could not allow the Romans the chance to fortify their position, and so he positioned his men in ambush on a hill on the other side of the river. He also had his troops construct hedge-like obstructions, which were placed on the other side of the river to disrupt the Roman formations and cavalry. Caesar marched his army in two groups. His veteran 6 legions, who marched in the front, were the first to reach the river, and began constructing a camp on the hill with the river in front, while the 2 newer legions marched behind with the baggage train.
Per usual, though.
Caesar sent his cavalry and light infantry across the river, which was only 3 feet deep, in order to scout the opposite bank. They were met by some Nervii cavalry, and a brief skirmish broke out. However, the Belgae cavalry fell back, drawing in the Romans until the entire Nervii force
It's an ambush!
broke cover and fell upon them. The Roman cavalry and light infantry broke and ran back across the river to the Roman camp, the Nervii army in hot pursuit. Thus started the Battle of the Sabis River.
Look at that line they just formed. The Nervi's not bad.
The Belgae moved from the woods and across the river so fast that the legions had almost no time to prepare. However, their experience and discipline kicked in. Rallying to the nearest cohort and legionary standards, they were able to put together a coherent battle line. But as the legionary engineers did not have time to clear the campsite as they usually would, the legions were divided by the hedge-like obstructions laid down by Bodugnatus, which prevented them from forming a cohesive formation.
Very smart. Because all at once the Roman line is formidable. This gives them some sort of advantage, but at the same time, if they lose one of these micro battles, then they get routed at one of these places, then those leftover troops from the Roman side can then encircle you. So it's definitely a gamble.
As a result, the legions were almost fighting 3 separate battles, the 10th and the 9th on the left against the Atrebati, the 11th and 8th in the centre against the Virumandui, and the 12th and 7th on the right against the largest group, the Nervii, with 2 remaining legions.
Okay, so this isn't just the Nervi, they have allies with this, okay.
Still with the baggage train yet to join the battle. The fighting was brutal, with Caesar himself going from group to group, encouraging his men. Eventually the Roman left was able to push their enemy back enough to hurl their javelins into their ranks and charge. They were able to force the Atrebati back across the river, even making it into the Belgae camp. The Roman centre was also finding success, pushing the Virumandui down to the banks of the river.
I have a bad feeling about the Nervi side though.
However, the Roman right was having a hard time. With the centre pushing forwards, the Nervii poured into the gap, almost surrounding the 12th and 7th legions and falling upon the auxiliaries who had retreated to the camp. The remaining auxiliaries, including most of the Roman cavalry who had been marching in front of the baggage train, saw this and fled, assuming the Roman right had been
Caesar's gonna hate that.
completely destroyed and the battle lost. They were not without reason. The 12th had lost their standard, their chief centurion, most of the other centurions, and the Romans were beginning to break.
Dang, they need reinforcements. These other legions that have won their skirmishes or battles need to come help them immediately.
Seeing this disaster, Caesar knew he would have to do something or risk losing the whole campaign. Snatching up a shield, he pushed himself to the front line of the legion, bolstering the morale of the men. With the 7th Legion under heavy pressure as well, Caesar ordered them to form a defensive square with the 12th and hold their ground. At this point, the battle began to swing in the Romans' favour. Labienus, in charge of the 10th and 9th Legions, saw what was happening from the other side of the river and sent the 10th to relieve the Roman right.
Okay, so this is GG's at this point. They created this L like format, which is going to collapse pretty quickly.
While the remaining 2 legions had finally joined the battle and were attacking the Nervii in the Roman camp. The Roman auxiliary cavalry also returned to the battle, seeing this change in fortune, and now it was the Nervii who faced disaster. The Virimandui had fled upon seeing the Roman reinforcements, and the Nervii were now surrounded. They fought bravely, and even Caesar commended them later, but their defeat was now inevitable. The Belgae casualties were devastating, Caesar saying that just 500 survived the battle. The Roman losses had also been high, with perhaps as many as 5,000 Romans dead. Without Caesar's personal leadership and the timely interventions of the legions, it is likely that the battle would have been lost, Caesar killed, and the campaign ended.
The butterfly effect of that would have been astronomical.
But the battle was over, and Caesar was once again victorious. The Nervii surrendered, becoming a vassal of Rome, and the Atrebati were conquered soon after. Rome was now in control of most of Gaul. By 56 BC, Caesar had subjugated the majority of Gaul, either through conquest or political alliances, and was beginning to look for new opportunities to expand Rome's influence.
Oh yeah, this is where he crosses the Rhine.
But not all the Gallic tribes were taking kindly to Roman rule. One such tribe was the Veneti, located in modern Brittany. Despite signing a peace treaty with Caesar the year before, they reneged on this promise and captured a few Roman officers. As a largely seafaring nation, the Veneti were confident that they would be able to put their faith in their navy and force Caesar to make concessions. However, Caesar spent no time trying to negotiate, instead seeing the act as a direct declaration of war, and marched on the tribe.
Because, Rome doesn't really have a navy. They do, but it's not that great compared to their battle on land.
Initially, he found little success. Due to their large navy, the Veneti were able to effectively hop from town to town, moving entire populaces and their belongings, denying the Romans a pitched battle or siege. Standard Roman tactics proved ineffective therefore, and it was clear that, in order to win, Caesar had to defeat the navy. With no navy on hand, he ordered that a fleet be built in order to take on the Veneti navy. But compared to the Roman ships, which were designed for the Mediterranean, the Veneti ships, designed for the Atlantic, were much stronger and taller, and the Romans found them impossible to ram or board.
If you guys do know, how far did the Veneti boats go at sea if they're designed for the Atlantic? Like, did they try to cross the Atlantic ever?
It was only through the ingenuity of one of his legates, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who suggested that they use billhooks to cut down the sails and cripple the Veneti boats, that Caesar was able to defeat their navy. With this issue sorted, it now seemed that Caesar would be able to move on to new conquests.
The Gaul is his at this point. Technically.
Once again though, his plans were put on hold in 55 BC, when yet another roaming German horde, composed of Usipetes and Tenchtheri, began threatening the Rhine border. These tribes previously rivaled the Suebi, but were now fleeing in huge numbers, Caesar giving their total number, including civilians, as 430,000. They had already slaughtered the Menapii and stolen their ships in order to cross the river, and were now pouring into Gaul.
Looks like we're gonna have another one of those migration halts.
Upon hearing about this, Caesar was once again compelled to act, as he was worried that the Gauls might join the Germans in an attempt to oust the Romans. Some Gallic tribes in the Rhine Valley had indeed sent emissaries to the Germans, providing them with food and intelligence, encouraging them to move deeper into Gaul.
Yeah, especially those that still have hard feelings against him when he had the Belgae campaign.
Caesar gathered a council of Gallic chiefs and convinced them to provide more cavalry for him to confront the Germans.
Important stuff.
This served two purposes. Firstly, Rome's cavalry had always been lacking, and the Gauls were renowned horsemen, and so filled a crucial role in the army. And secondly, because cavalry was composed largely of nobles or wealthy persons, they would act as hostages, ensuring good behavior. He then gathered 5 of his legions and headed to the Rhine. The Germans had sent a portion of their cavalry ahead of their main force in order to carry out raiding missions, but hearing that Caesar was getting close, they sent emissaries in order to delay him. They asked Caesar to negotiate, claiming that they were only in Gaul because they had been forced to flee from the Suebi, and promised to ally with Rome if Caesar could provide them with land in Gaul.
I don't think Caesar's going to buy it.
However, Caesar suspected that the Germans were delaying and continued his advance. The envoys continued back and forth as Caesar continued to progress towards the German camp, sending forward his 5,000 cavalry as an advanced force, but with orders not to provoke them into attack. However, upon seeing the Roman cavalry separated from the main force, the Germans fell upon them. The Romans initially tried to hold their ground, but were eventually overwhelmed and retreated to the safety of Caesar's camp.
Good.
Caesar likely underplays the amount of casualties taken, giving the number as 74, but he does mention that 2 brothers of the famous and influential Piso family had died in the fighting, something that Caesar could not let go unpunished. Refusing to hold back any longer, Caesar gathered his force to attack the Germans. But before he moved off, the Germans sent a party of diplomats, including high-ranking nobility, to treat with Caesar.
Why would you do that after you killed some of his men? That's kind of interesting.
Once again asking for peace and apologizing for the attack. As the Germans had already attacked apparently without provocation, Caesar refused and took the delegates as prisoners. He then drew up his army in 3 lines and moved swiftly to the German camp.
They don't know he's coming.
Germans, assuming that Caesar still would have been delayed by their envoys, were caught completely unaware. The legions fell upon their camp. Caesar brushes over the details, but it seems to have been somewhat of a massacre. The fleeing Germans were pursued by the Roman cavalry. Some made it across the river in their boats, but many tried to swim across and drowned. Hearing of the defeat, the German cavalry, which had been pillaging, returned across the Rhine. Caesar's army had taken minimal casualties.
That was pretty
It is
swift.
important to note that while Caesar portrayed this as a great victory against a marauding Germanic horde, this is not how others saw it. To Caesar's political rivals in Rome, Caesar had broken the armistice with the Germans by antagonizing them with his cavalry, imprisoned diplomats, which was effectively a declaration of war, and then carried out a massacre, including civilians.
Understandable. Understandable.
Caesar needed something to distract the Senate and win the minds of the people, so he decided to boost his popularity by doing what no Roman general had ever done before:
Cross the Rhine?
crossing the Rhine.
Yep.
The Germanic tribe Ubii offered its ships, hoping that the Romans would assist in their war against the Suebi. Caesar, however, deemed this unworthy of the Roman people, and instead decided to build a bridge across the Rhine between modern Andernach and Neuwied. It was an engineering marvel. The legion's engineers used winches to act as pile drivers, driving stakes deep into the river, and constructed the 140 to 400 meter by 7 to 9 meter bridge in just 10 days.
That's insane.
Caesar found the lands beyond the Rhine almost deserted. Taken aback by the Romans' speed and their feat of engineering, the Germanic tribes in the area had retreated deep into the Germanic forests, where they had amassed a significant army. However, Caesar had no desire to be caught in a prolonged campaign in foreign territory against a notoriously dangerous enemy. He spent just 18 days on the German side of the Rhine, burning villages and crop fields before returning and dismantling the bridge.
Not a long time.
The campaign was a proof, not only to the Germans but also to Caesar's rivals in Rome, that he could overcome anything and do as he pleased.
And with that, I'm sure that the next thing he's going to do is go across the English Channel.
Caesar's next ambition, Britain, was once again a perfect propaganda target.
And with that, that's going to be the end of this video. We saw the Belgae get taken down. We saw the Western tribe. I forget the name of the tribe. Go back real quick so we can remember. They're so close together in terms of like phonics or a lot of these. What was it? The Veneti. Yeah, the Veneti. They they didn't really last long. And then he crossed the Rhine with a marvelous bridge. Of course, he now tore down so other people would not be able to use it. So basically, Rome's getting heated with his atrocities that they have claimed that he has done, and now he will probably try to cross the English Channel, which is very interesting to see how this goes. I kind of already know what happens, but at the same time, I like kings and generals, and I love how they display it. I'll see you guys in the next video, which will be Caesar in Britain. See you there. Peace out. Bye-bye.